Mamdani grew up in a wealthy family with Hollywood connections. His background gave him access, education, elite networks, all the advantages of American capitalism. And somehow that led him to conclude that capitalism itself is the problem. There's something almost poetic about that irony, isn't there? The system gave him everything he needed to succeed, and his response is to tear it down for everyone else. But here's what makes him different from some campus activist handing out pamphlets. He's learned how to package radical ideas in soft, compassionate language. He speaks in that calm, measured tone that makes everything sound reasonable. He uses words like justice, equity, international law, humanitarian principles. Who could argue with any of that? It's like disagreeing with sunshine or puppies. According to recent prediction markets, and we're talking about platforms where people put real money on outcomes, not just opinion polls, Mamdani is now the favorite to win the New York City mayoral race. Think about what that means. America's largest city, the financial capital of the world, home to over 8 million people. And the person most likely to lead it just went on national television and said something that should disqualify anyone from holding public office. Let me take you inside that CNN interview, because this is where things went from concerning to genuinely alarming. The host professional prepared asked him a straightforward question about Benjamin Netanyahu visiting New York for the United Nations General Assembly. There's an international criminal court warrant out for Netanyahu. It's controversial, politically charged, and has exactly zero authority over American soil or American policy. The United States isn't even a member of that court. So the host asked, "If you're mayor, will you have Netanyahu arrested if he comes to New York?" Now, a reasonable answer would be something like, "That's not within a mayor's authority. Foreign policy is handled at the federal level. My job is fixing the subway and keeping streets safe. Simple, truthful, constitutional." But that's not what happened. Mamdani said, but the meaning is clear, that New York City should uphold international criminal court warrants, that the city believes in international law, that accountability must be present. And then he added Vladimir Putin to the list. The president of Russia, he said he'd pursue every legal avenue to ensure both leaders face accountability if they set foot in New York City. Let me break down why this matters, because it's not just about politics or partisanship. This is about how systems work or don't work when people start making up rules based on personal feelings rather than actual law. First, the constitutional issue. The United States Constitution gives the federal government, specifically the president, exclusive authority over foreign policy. That's not an accident. The founders understood that if every city and state conducted its own foreign relations, we'd have chaos. Imagine if Miami recognized one government, Seattle recognized another, and Chicago declared neutrality. It's not a country anymore, it's 50 separate nations wearing the same flag. A mayor cannot arrest a foreign head of state. Full stop. It doesn't matter how strongly he feels about it. It doesn't matter if an international court issued a warrant. The International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over the United States. We never joined it. We never ratified its authority. And even if we had, enforcing international warrants would still be a federal matter, not something the NYPD handles between parking tickets. But here's where it gets even more concerning. Let's say, hypothetically, that Mamdani becomes mayor and actually tries this. Let's say Putin visits the UN and Mamdani orders the NYPD to arrest him. What happens next? Well, first, you'd have a massive armed confrontation. Foreign leaders don't travel alone. They bring security, serious, highly trained security that's authorized to protect their principal by any means necessary. Russian Federal Protective Service agents aren't going to politely step aside while New York cops try to handcuff their president. You'd have an armed standoff in Manhattan. People would die. Americans would die. And then what? Let's say somehow they actually manage to take Putin into custody. Do you think Russia just accepts that? Do you think they file a complaint with the UN and wait for diplomacy to work? No. You've just effectively declared war. Russia would respond, maybe economically cutting off energy, collapsing markets. Maybe militarily targeting American interests abroad, maybe worse. And all because one mayor decided his personal moral compass supersedes the entire framework of international relations. This isn't a video game, this isn't a thought experiment, this is the real world, where actions have consequences, and those consequences can spiral fast. Now, you might be thinking, surely he doesn't actually mean it. Surely this is just rhetoric for his progressive base. And maybe you're right. Maybe he's just saying what he needs to say to win votes from activists who want to hear that kind of talk. But here's the problem. When politicians say dangerous things to win elections, they create expectations. Their supporters start to believe those things will actually happen. And when reality doesn't match the promise, you get anger, disillusionment, radicalization, or worse, sometimes politicians actually tried to keep those impossible promises. And that's when systems break. What really struck me watching that interview wasn't just what Mamdani said, it was how he said it. There was no hesitation, no acknowledgement of complexity, no recognition that what he was proposing could lead to genuine disaster, just calm confidence, like he was describing a minor policy adjustment instead of potentially dragging America into international conflict. And the host? She looked uncomfortable, you could see it in her eyes, but she didn't push back. She didn't say, wait, that's unconstitutional. She didn't ask, how would that work logistically? She didn't point out the obvious risks. She just moved on to the next question. That moment tells you something important about where we are as a country. The media has become so afraid of being labeled biased, so desperate to appear balanced, that they've stopped calling out actual absurdities. When someone proposes something fundamentally disconnected from how government works, the response shouldn't be polite nodding. It should be clarification, correction, basic civic education. But that's not happening anymore. And that's how fringe ideas quietly become mainstream talking points. Think about it like this. Imagine you're an engineer building a bridge, and someone suggests using cardboard instead of steel because it's cheaper and more environmentally friendly. You wouldn't just smile and say, interesting perspective. You'd explain why that can't work, why physics doesn't care about good intentions, why bridges built on feelings collapse. Politics works the same way. Or at least, it should. There are structures, systems, laws, frameworks that exist for good reasons. And when someone proposes ignoring those frameworks, the response matters. Silence is permission. Politeness is enablement. But let's zoom out for a moment, because the arrest comments aren't happening in isolation. They're part of a broader pattern, a whole platform of ideas that sound compassionate until you think through what they actually mean. Mamdani has promised to spend somewhere between $60 and $70 million of taxpayer money on free gender transition surgeries. Now, set aside your personal views on that issue for a second, and just think about the mechanics. New York City is already running massive budget deficits. Basic services, schools, infrastructure, public safety are underfunded. And the proposal is to redirect tens of millions of dollars to elective medical procedures for a tiny fraction of the population. He's also promised to decriminalize prostitution, dramatically reduce police funding, provide over $100 million in free legal services for people in the country illegally, and establish what he calls a sanctuary city for healthcare workers who want to perform procedures banned in other states. Again, you might support some of those ideas individually. That's fine, people can disagree on policy. But taken together, what do they represent? They represent a vision of government that's fundamentally about redistribution and moral signaling rather than practical governance. They represent prioritizing ideology over infrastructure, feelings over functionality. And here's the thing that worries me most. All of these promises are wrapped in the language of justice and compassion. Who doesn't want justice? Who doesn't want compassion? But justice without wisdom is just revenge, and compassion without limits is just chaos. Real leadership isn't about making people feel good in the moment. It's about making decisions that actually work, that stand up to reality, that survive contact with the complexity of the real world. It's about building systems that function not just for the loudest activists, but for everyone who depends on those systems to work. Let me tell you what I think is really happening here, and why this moment matters beyond just one candidate in one city. We're watching what happens when a generation of people who grew up hearing they could change the world through sheer moral conviction actually reaches positions of power. These are people who were told that systems and structures are just social constructs, things that can be reimagined, rebuilt, torn down, and replaced based on whatever feels right. And in some ways, they're correct. Systems are human creations. They can be changed, but they can't be changed arbitrarily. You can't just declare that gravity works differently because you don't like how things fall. Reality has constraints, physics has rules, and so does governance. When Mamdani says he believes in international law over American sovereignty, what he's really saying is that his personal moral framework supersedes the constitutional order. That's not democracy. That's not progress. That's actually pretty close to the definition of tyranny rule based on one person's will rather than established law. The scary part isn't that one politician thinks this way. The scary part is that enough people agree with him to make him a front-runner for leading one of the most important cities on earth. Think about what that means. It means the message is resonating. It means there's an audience, a large audience that hears someone say, "I'll arrest world leaders based on my interpretation of international law," and thinks, yes, finally, someone with courage. Not, wait, that's insane and illegal, but that's the kind of bold leadership we need. How did we get here? Part of it is genuine frustration. People are hurting. The cost of living in places like New York has become genuinely unaffordable for average families. Housing is astronomical. Groceries cost more every month. Crime is up in many neighborhoods. The subway is unreliable. Basic city services feel like they're deteriorating. So when someone comes along and says, the system is broken, we need to tear it down and start over, that resonates with people who feel like the current system has failed them. I get that. I understand that impulse. When you're struggling to make rent, when your neighborhood doesn't feel safe, when it seems like the people in charge don't care, radical change starts to sound appealing. But here's the hard truth. Tearing down systems is easy. Building better ones is hard. Really hard. And the people who promise to tear everything down rarely have a functional plan for what comes next. They have slogans, they have passion, they have moral certainty, but they don't have blueprints that work. What makes Mamdani particularly effective and particularly dangerous is that he's mastered a specific rhetorical strategy. It's something I call moral armor. Every position he takes is framed not as a policy preference, but as a moral imperative. Not I think we should spend money this way, but justice demands we spend money this way. Not I prefer this approach, but anything else is complicity in oppression. Once you frame everything in moral absolutes, disagreement becomes evil. If supporting international law is the moral position, then anyone who disagrees isn't just wrong, they're immoral. They're complicit in war crimes. They're on the side of oppression. It's a brilliant rhetorical move, actually. It shuts down debate before debate can even start. Because who wants to be called immoral? Who wants to be accused of supporting genocide or racism or injustice? So people stay quiet. They don't push back. They let the absurdities slide because challenging them feels too costly. And that's how dangerous ideas become normalized. One unchallenged statement at a time. You saw it perfectly in that CNN interview when Mamdani was asked if he's a communist. And let's be clear, his policies align pretty closely with communist economic theory. He just calmly said, "No, I'm a democratic socialist." And the host accepted that. No follow-up, no asking what the practical difference is, no pointing out that democratic socialism is just a rebranding of the same ideas that have failed everywhere they've been tried. It's like asking someone, "Are you a wolf?" And they respond, "No, I'm a cute puppy." And you just accept that without noticing the teeth and claws. Labels only matter if they accurately describe reality. You can call yourself whatever you want, but your actions reveal the truth. And when someone proposes government control of major industries, massive wealth redistribution, defunding police while expanding government services, and subordinating American sovereignty to international bodies, that's not democratic socialism. That's just socialism with better marketing. Here's another thing that struck me. Mamdani quoted Martin Luther King Jr. to justify his economic policies. He pulled out a quote about wealth distribution and presented it as if MLK would have supported his platform, and again, nobody challenged it. Now, I'm not going to claim to know exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. would think about modern politics, but I do know this. Dr. King believed in the American constitutional system. He called on America to live up to its ideals, not to tear down its foundations. He appealed to shared values, not tribal divisions. He built coalitions, not echo chambers. Using his words to justify policies that would fundamentally dismantle the American economic system strikes me as deeply dishonest. It's wrapping radical ideas in the moral authority of a beloved historical figure who isn't here to clarify or object. And the audience applauds, because they hear Martin Luther King and justice and wealth distribution, and it all sounds righteous. They don't stop to think about what it actually means or whether it would actually work. That's the power of moral framing. It bypasses critical thinking, it appeals directly to emotion, and emotions are powerful. They can inspire revolutions, topple governments, reshape societies. But emotions without reason are just chaos looking for direction. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you're sick, really sick, and you need treatment. Two doctors present options. The first doctor says, "I understand you're suffering. I care deeply about your pain, and because I care, I'm going to give you the most powerful painkillers available, as much as you want, whenever you want." That sounds compassionate, right? That doctor really cares. The second doctor says, "I understand you're suffering. Treatment will be difficult and uncomfortable, but here's what will actually heal you long term." That doesn't feel as good in the moment. That doctor seems less caring. But which doctor is actually serving your interests? The one offering unlimited painkillers might make you feel better today, but 6 months from now you're addicted, your underlying condition is worse, and you're in far more danger than when you started. That's the difference between leadership and demagoguery. Leadership tells you hard truths and offers real solutions. Demagoguery tells you comforting lies and offers impossible promises. Mamdani is offering painkillers. He's telling struggling New Yorkers, "It's not your fault, it's the billionaire's fault. It's not complexity, it's oppression. And I'll fix everything by making the bad people pay." That feels good to hear. It's emotionally satisfying. It gives you someone to blame and a hero to trust. But it doesn't fix the subway. It doesn't make housing more affordable. It doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't create sustainable systems. What it does do is increase division, centralize power, and create dependency. Because once you convince people that they're victims who need a savior, they'll keep electing saviors, each one promising more, each one delivering less, each one expanding government control a little further. Now let's talk about what happens if these ideas actually get implemented. Because we're not in theoretical territory anymore. Mamdani is likely going to win, and when he does, he'll have actual power over an actual city with actual people whose lives depend on governance that works. What happens when he tries to arrest a foreign leader? Best case scenario, the federal government steps in, overrules him, and makes clear that mayors don't conduct foreign policy. He looks foolish, his supporters feel betrayed, and tensions rise between city and federal government. Worst case scenario, he actually tries it. Armed confrontation ensues, people die, and America gets pulled into an international crisis that spirals in ways nobody can predict. What happens when he defunds the police in a city that's already seeing rising crime? Wealthier neighborhoods hire private security. Poorer neighborhoods suffer. Crime increases. Businesses leave. Tax revenue drops. Services get cut. The city enters a spiral that's very hard to reverse. What happens when he spends hundreds of millions on programs that sound compassionate but aren't sustainable? Budget deficits explode. Essential services get cut to fund political priorities. The bond rating drops. Borrowing costs increase. The fiscal crisis deepens. I'm not being pessimistic here. I'm being realistic. We have historical examples. We've seen cities try versions of these policies before. We know how it ends. Good intentions don't suspend economic reality. But here's the deeper concern, what this represents for America's future. Because New York isn't unique. The same dynamics playing out there are playing out in cities across the country. Activists with strong ideological convictions and limited governance experience are winning elections by promising radical change to frustrated voters. And the media isn't pushing back. The institutions that should be providing accountability, journalism, academia, civic organizations are either sympathetic to the ideology or too afraid of being labeled as opponents to speak up. That's how democracies slide into dysfunction, not through military coups or dramatic revolutions, but through gradual erosion, through the normalization of ideas that used to be fringe, through the silencing of dissent, through the replacement of reason with emotion. Let me be clear about something. I'm not saying everyone needs to agree on politics. I'm not saying there's only one right answer to complex problems. Reasonable people can disagree about tax rates, spending priorities, regulatory approaches. All of that is legitimate political debate. What I am saying is that certain principles have to remain fixed if we want functional governance. The rule of law has to matter. The Constitution has to be more than a suggestion. Reality has to be acknowledged.
And leaders have to be honest about trade-offs rather than promising everything to everyone.
When those principles erode, everything else becomes unstable. Think of it like building a house. You can disagree about interior design, paint colors, furniture choices. That's all preference. But you can't disagree about whether the foundation needs to be solid. You can't decide that load-bearing walls are optional because they interfere with your open concept vision. Physics doesn't care about your aesthetic preferences. Government works the same way. There are load-bearing structures, constitutional limits, separation of powers, rule of law, fiscal reality. You can work within those constraints creatively. But you can't just remove them because they're inconvenient. So what do? What's the answer when political discourse has become this disconnected from reality? First, we have to stay grounded. When someone makes a claim that sounds too good to be true, free everything, no trade-offs, just tax the rich, and all problems disappear, it probably is too good to be true. Not because people are lying necessarily, but because reality is more complex than slogans. Second, we have to ask questions. When a politician promises something, ask how. Not just what they'll do, but how they'll do it. What are the costs? What are the trade-offs? What could go wrong? If they can't answer those questions, or if they dismiss them as pessimism, that's a red flag. Third, we have to hold media accountable. When journalists let absurdities pass without challenge, call it out. Support outlets that still believe in asking hard questions, regardless of who's in power. And fourth, maybe most importantly, we have to remember that real progress is slow, incremental, and built on solid foundations. It's not exciting. It doesn't make great speeches. It won't go viral on social media, but it works. The people who built America's greatest achievements, the infrastructure, the institutions, the systems that allowed unprecedented prosperity and freedom, weren't revolutionaries promising to tear everything down. They were builders, engineers, people who understood that lasting change requires patience, precision, and respect for what came before, even as you improve upon it. That's the mentality we need to reclaim. Not nostalgia for some imaginary past, but respect for the principles that actually work. Innovation, yes. Improvement, absolutely. But grounded in reality, not ideology. Look, I know this has been heavy. These aren't easy topics, and the stakes are real. But here's the thing. Moments like this, when someone running for major office says something that should be obviously disqualifying and the media just shrugs, these moments define whether we're going to remain a nation of laws or become a nation of whoever shouts loudest. And the outcome isn't determined by politicians, it's determined by citizens, by whether enough people pay attention, ask questions, and demand accountability, by whether we choose leaders based on their ability to govern or their ability to make us feel good. The future isn't written by the loudest voices. It's written by the people who show up, stay informed, and insist on truth, even when it's uncomfortable. So here's what I'm asking. Pay attention to what's actually being said, not just how it makes you feel. Watch the full interviews, not just the clips. Read multiple sources. Ask questions. Think critically. And when you see something that doesn't make sense, like a mayor claiming authority to arrest world leaders, trust your instincts. You're not crazy. It really doesn't make sense. and then talk about it, share information, have conversations, not arguments, but real discussions where the goal is understanding rather than winning. Because the antidote to bad ideas isn't silence, it's better ideas, clearly explained, widely shared. This isn't about left versus right. It's about functional versus dysfunctional, reality versus fantasy, governance versus performance art. If you found value in this breakdown,